Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And sitting in for the everlasting and dashing Nick Savari, I'm Alex Kliment from GZERO Media.
Ooh, look at that. Way better than Sabrina's intro. On the program, we're going to get into some of that. I don't know if Nick Savari is any of those things, but on the program today, Brittney Griner returns home to the United States, and some people are upset, Alex. We're going to get into that in a second. I don't know why, but the latest on the war in Ukraine, nobody better to educate us on that, and we're going to get into Alex's great piece that you could check out over at GZERO Media. Plus, later on in our final segment, the world in 10 minutes. Remember like the 10-10 wins? We give you 22. You give us 22 minutes, we give you the world. Alex and I are going to take you around the world in under 10 minutes. A new segment we're going to debut on the show. Alex, you have been on this program before. I say hello normally to Nick. I say hello to you now. Why don't you tell the people a little bit that don't listen to the show, maybe new people coming into the show, tell them a little bit of what you do over at GZERO Media and about yourself.
All right, we'll do. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be back. I guess I was on the show for 7 months ago,
Yeah.
a little shortly after the war in Ukraine started. And you guys were kind enough to have me on, so good to be back. My name is Alex Kliment. I am an editor and producer at GZERO Media, which is a media company based in New York that covers global politics. We try to cover it in a way that makes it make sense for normal people who are not like at the Council on Foreign Relations like all the time, right? So just for normal folks, like what's going on in the world and what does it mean? I write for a newsletter there called Signal, which I encourage you all, if I can do some shameless promotion, I encourage you all to sign up for. It's a popular morning global politics newsletter.
I am signed up for that. It is very good.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I do some work on a television program that we have called GZERO World with Ian Bremmer, which you can see on PBS affiliates around the country. And I produce a puppet satire show called Puppet Regime, which you can check out on our website. That's who I am and what I do. I'm from New York, and that's where I live. And that's about it.
That's right. And all of this will be available on his profile that we'll put up on the show links. We're going to put profiles for everybody to see Alex's content. You do great work over there. You know how much I'm a fan of your stuff. I was actually watching something of you on Stephanie Ruhl's show, I think, or somebody on MSNBC a while back when you were explaining Russia, Ukraine. So you did a great job there. And let's get into our first segment because there's nobody better than you. And this is the reason why we kind of had you. It's perfect timing, by the way. Who knew that former WNBA star, and she'll be back in the WNBA when it plays. I doubt she'll play in Russia ever again, basketball-wise. We'll get into that. Obviously, Brittney Griner, if you haven't heard the news, you heard the clip at the top of the program there and the prisoner swap that happened this past week that kind of took over and dominated the news cycle over the last couple of days. Obviously, Russia letting go of Brittney Griner in exchange for Victor Bout, the arms dealer that was exchanged in this prisoner swap. President Biden gave a speech last week with Kamala Harris and Brittney's wife there after meeting her in the Oval Office. Let's take a listen to what the president said last week.
Moments ago, standing together with her wife Sherelle in the Oval Office, I spoke with Brittney Griner. She's safe. She's on a plane. She's on her way home. After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittney will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones, and she should have been there all along. She wrote to me back in July. She didn't ask for special treatment, even though we've been working on a release from the day one. She requested a simple quote, "Please don't forget about me and the other American detainees. Please do all you can to bring us home." We never forgot about Brittney. We've not forgotten about Paul Whelan, who's been unjustly detained in Russia for years. This was not a choice of which American to bring home. We brought home Trevor Reed when we had a chance early this year. Sadly, for totally illegitimate reasons, Russia is treating Paul's case differently than Brittney's. And while we have not yet succeeded in securing Paul's release, we are not giving up. We will never give up.
All right, so the president said a lot there. We're going to break down a lot of that. First, Alex, let me turn to you because, well, there's nobody else here, but nobody better as well. To talk a little bit about this prisoner swap. Everyone, at least in the right-wing media circles, is making a huge deal about who was part of this exchange on the Russian side. You heard what the president just said there in terms of how they're treating Paul Whelan's case. We're going to get into Paul in a second. But when you heard the news of Brittney getting released, who she was released for, what do you make of all of it?
Well, look, the first thing to say is that there's almost no doubt that the Biden administration saved Brittney Griner's life here. Um, I have not been to a Russian penal colony, but I have seen the inside of a Russian prison, not as an inmate, as a visitor, I assure you. And it is a grim situation, even for Russian-speaking hardened criminals from Russia. It is impossible to overstate the infernal, torturous hell that awaited Brittney Griner in a Russian penal colony as a non-Russian who doesn't speak Russian, who is Black, who is female, who is a lesbian, who is American. I mean, that is, I don't know what the sixth version of a trifecta is, the sexfect, whatever it is. That is like the worst possible combination of things you could be in a Russian prison colony. I mean, I really think that she would not have lasted more than a few years there. So that's the first thing, is that I think the Biden administration, from a human perspective, saved this woman's life. The reason that people were upset about it, or questioned the deal that was made, is that Victor Bout is someone who, he's a renowned arms trafficker. If any of your listeners have seen Lord of War and Nick Cage, he's based on Victor Bout's character. He's a prodigious arms smuggler and arms seller who has run billions of dollars of weapons into every single horrific conflict you can name around the world, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere, former Soviet Union, you name it, his weapons were there. He is a person of incalculable intelligence value to the Russian government and practical value, right? The Russian government likes to be able to meddle in conflicts around the world and do it without direct fingerprints, right? And so a guy like Victor Bout has tremendous value to them from a national security perspective, from a foreign policy perspective, from an intelligence perspective. Brittney Griner does not have the same value to the American government from a national security perspective, from a foreign policy perspective, right? So people said this was a really unfair trade. We gave up the world's most notorious merchant of death, a criminal arms smuggler of the highest order, in exchange for a professional athlete who happened to have some CBD oil in her baggage and was like transparently politically framed as part of that. Not framed. I mean, the laws are what they are in Russia, right. But the discretion was there for them not to throw her in jail for 10 years for this, right? And they did it anyway. So people were upset about that, or said, this seems really imbalanced. And at first sight, I'll be honest, when I looked at it, I was like, wow, the Russians really got a lot more out of this than the Americans did, right? But as I thought about it more, I think that was the wrong initial take, actually. Because if you think about, I mean, leaving aside the question that, like, we just, talked about, we saved Brittney Griner's life here. If you think about what makes Russia tick, or the Russian government tick, versus what makes the American government tick, like, the Russian government is not concerned with, like, what the Russian people think. I mean, Victor Bout is known in Russia, but it's not like he's a cause célèbre for a large proportion of the Russian population. What it's important for Putin's regime to get Victor Bout back, not because he's concerned about how it looks to the Russian people, but because all his boys in the security services are like, we would really love to get this guy back. He's super valuable to us, right? And there's already news that he's like, Western intelligence agencies are worried he's going to pick up right where he left off and start running weapons to Africa and South America and places in Asia as well. So what Russia cares about is different than what America cares about. I think for the Biden administration, the optics of allowing a prominent Black female lesbian athlete to potentially die in a Russian prison, right? This meant a lot to millions and millions of American people, right? And I think it's just a difference in how different kinds of regimes respond to different pressures, right? Like a democratic regime, I mean, the US is plenty hypocritical in the way it does foreign policy, all kinds of things. I mean, but when you get at a basic level, the US is a democracy that needs to respond to certain pressures from voters and from population, from society, right? And I just think that there's something important about that for the American government that said, hey, actually, it really is important strategically for us to get Brittney Griner back. It is important for us to show the American people that we will get people like this back when we can, so that the trade is not as lopsided as it looked. It's not like, it's not like the Russians got Mike Trout in exchange for some like AAA journeyman pitcher, right? I mean, it's like, if you think about the criteria, they're just different, right? What Russia got, Victor Bout's really important. And for a lot of things that the US values as well, human rights issue, concerns, the precedent that it sets, the way that it looked, the type of person she was, it was important, particularly for a Democrat president, to be seen doing everything that he can do to get her out. So I think it's not quite as lopsided as it looks, even though from a pure, like, hard power perspective, the Russians probably got more out of it.
It's very interesting that you said some of that, because I think a lot of pundits on television have been talking about 2024, right? And if Joe Biden decides to run again, how this will look to voters that potentially could be, on the fence about Joe Biden. Again, a lot of the times foreign policy is kind of lower on voter issues, but here's getting back an American that was, again, not falsely imprisoned, but the sentencing, like you mentioned, right? 9.5 years. Think about you flying in a normal airport right now. You're not getting 9.5 years. And especially, she's been playing in basketball in Russia for 7 years consecutive. Yeah. They know who she is. Everybody knows who Brittney Griner is. She's very tough to miss. I've met Brittney Griner before. She's 6'9". So it's tough to miss. You're not going to miss Brittney Griner. I do want to get to the Paul Whelan part of this, because, and I don't want to get down the rabbit holes of, specific super far right folks that have made this comparison about we left a Marine behind, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen people tweet that, but I do want to play for the folks something Paul Whelan's sister said. She was on an interview recently on Newsmax talking about her brother. And of course, the question is kind of framed in a terrible way by the person. Of course, you know where the leanings are. But I want you to take a listen to her answer. We're going to react on the other side. Take a listen to this.
Why would one person be treated, even by our own government, different than the other? They both meet the same criteria that they set. Why would they leave Paul there, a decorated Marine?
Well, unfortunately, it's really Russia's fault. I mean, overall, from the time that Paul was arrested, Russia put him in a different category. And even though both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, tried to get Paul back, and in fact, after Trevor Reed and Brittney Griner both were arrested, tried to sort of bundle them up together, the Russians insisted on dividing them up and trying to have a different deal for Paul, and ask for something different. And my feeling is that they purposefully separated out Brittney Griner and the deal for her because they knew how much trouble it would cause.
Can you explain for our listeners right now, and hearing her say that was a really great answer. You heard the framing of the question there. Obviously, you know what network that guy's on, or at least you would guess. But can you tell our audience a little bit about Paul Whelan? They're hearing this name. They don't understand it. Was he a Marine? Was he dishonorably discharged? What was he doing in Russia? Can you take our audience a little bit into the Paul Whelan case and why it is different and why he wasn't a part of this swap, potentially, as the sister alluded, that Russia is treating the case differently, as President Biden alluded himself?
Well, the reason that it's different is that the Russians believe that Paul Whelan truly was and is a spy. The U.S. government says he's not. That doesn't mean he's not. We don't know. And there's really, but the crucial difference is that it's the Russians distinguish between Brittney Griner, which was transparently political, right? Which, by the way, is how they see Victor Bout, which I'll get to in a second, from Paul Whelan, whom they view as a legitimately detained, potential, well, in their view, spy, right? So from what I understand, everything we've seen is that the Russians said, no, Whelan can't be part of the deal for Victor Bout. It's Griner or nothing. There was also a report that the Russians might try to throw in, there's a Russian assassin named Krasikov who's being held in Germany right now after killing someone in Germany. The German authorities hold this guy. The Russians allegedly wanted him as part of a 4-part deal with Whelan and Griner. The Germans said no. So a lot of it fell apart. But it's just, I think that the easiest way to think about why they're different is why the Russians see it as different, which is that they, basically threw the book at Griner, knowing that it was going to be a political point of leverage with the Americans, because everyone could see that this was ridiculous, but that there was no leverage to do anything about it. Whereas Whalen, I think they think they really do have something important in an actual spy, and that for them is simply a different category. Yeah, he's a former Marine who was detained while he was traveling in Russia in 2018, I guess. And the Russians weren't going to budge on him. So the Biden administration, basically what it looked like was they had the choice of Griner or nothing. And they chose Griner over nothing.
Yeah. Were you shocked at all of the timing of all this by President Biden? And obviously she has made the news, but obviously the news cycle is kind of lost a little bit in the Brittney Griner shuffle over the last couple of months. Whereas, all of a sudden you wake up on Thursday or Friday, whenever this kind of broke, and you're like, oh, wow, Brittney Griner's coming home. Next thing you know, you see her on a plane in Abu Dhabi and the exchange happening on the tarmac there. Were you kind of shocked at the timing of all this? Is it suspect, especially with what's going on with the war in Ukraine right now? We're going to get to that in a second, but the timing of it just kind of seems off, because why would Putin, we all feel it this side of the pond, that Putin was using her as a chip. We've mentioned she's been playing in Russia for 7 years. Her teammates came to her defense. She's carrying less than whatever the illegal amount would be there. And all of a sudden she's sentenced for 9.5 years in a Russian prison. The timing of it, is that off to you? All of a sudden, this is not even like a Friday news dump. It was just kind of like, oh, here's Brittney Griner for the Merchant of Death. But it's like, but isn't a war going on right now? Like, why would they do this right now? Take us inside that timing. Did you think it was a little bit suspect right now?
Not so much. I mean, I think one thing that I had read was that actually they may have had a potential deal in place sooner, but that Putin wanted to wait until after the midterms were over because he didn't want to give Biden anything ahead of the midterms. But no, I think, look, there has been it's a softening of rhetoric is a little, maybe makes it sound like too much, but let's say a softening of rhetoric a little bit on the US and Russian sides over the past couple of weeks in a way. Biden saying, I would be willing to sit down with Putin, with preconditions, and as long as I would do it with my NATO allies and so on. Putin, past couple of days, kind of backed off a little bit some of the nuclear threats he'd made earlier. So I think I get the impression that there has been a little more talking going on between the Russian and American sides about a whole host of issues. Back channel stuff, to be sure. I mean, there's not going to be a Biden-Putin phone call anytime soon. So that's one thing. But also, I mean, to be purely cynical about it, it's not a bad time for Russia to get Victor Bout back, right? If what they think they need is, a really slick way to get weapons into places fast that they haven't been able to do. So the timing of it didn't strike me as that odd. I think maybe just a couple things that I meant that I just mentioned maybe were part of it, but also, these negotiations, they go on under the surface for months and months and months. And then finally there's a breakthrough and everyone says, okay, let's do this. Yeah, it didn't strike me as that odd.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the war itself right now happening, because you just alluded there about Putin kind of coming off of those claims about nuclear risk. He said the war is going to take a while, and I want to test out your Russian here, Alex. The folks watching us on YouTube are going to see the subtitles of this, but the people listening in podcast format, I want to play a sound here from Putin recently talking about an attack on the energy infrastructure to his neighbor. And take a listen to this. Alex is going to translate some of it, and we're going to see if it matches up to what is playing on the video files. I didn't tell him this before we started recording, so take a listen to this.
Сейчас много шума по поводу наших ударов по энергетической инфраструктуре соседней страны. Да, мы делаем это. Но кто начал? Кто ударил по мосту, по Крымскому? Кто подорвал линии электропередач с атомной электростанции Курска? Кто не подает воду в Донецк? Неподача воды в миллионный город – это акт геноцида. Никто, нигде словом об этом не обмолвился. Вообще. Молчок полный. Стоит нам только пошевелиться, что-то сделать в ответ. Шум, гам, треск на всю Вселенную. Это не будет нам мешать выполнять боевые задачи.
obviously, in my limited Russian and hitting on women before my wife, honey, if you're listening to this, way before my wife, I got the niet part there and some other words there. But Alex, obviously, I alluded to it, and the people watching on YouTube saw he was talking about. He admitted to the attacks that are happening in Ukraine, but why don't you take our audience a little bit into why Putin gave this? It wasn't a presser. It was, I forget where the meeting happened. This was reported on The Guardian. He started talking to reporters and he was just saying, well, who attacked us first, right? And then he started giving reasons as to why they're doing attacks on the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. But why don't you take our audience into not only what Putin just said there, but the latest on what is happening in Ukraine now?
So yeah, so he basically says, look, there's been a lot of noise. People are really upset about us hitting the energy infrastructure of our neighboring country. Yes, we're doing it, and here's why. And he basically lays out what is kind of a lot of the Russian rationale for the invasion in the first place, which is the Ukrainian government has been trying to commit a genocide against Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine by limiting their access to water, to energy, all these things, right? So from Russia's perspective, what they're doing is attacking energy infrastructure, which to them is a legitimate target of their military campaign because that energy infrastructure supports what they see as the Ukrainian government's genocidal attacks on Russian speakers inside of Ukraine, and of course, part of the war effort more generally against Russia, right? So Russia's case is, yep, we're doing it, and it's legitimate because that infrastructure is part of Ukraine's war effort, right? Just about every single credible human rights organization in the world will disagree with that. What's really happening is, in my view, is that we're kind of getting from phase 3 to phase 4 of the war. Phase 1 of the war was, wow, Russia just invaded Ukraine. I wonder how many days Ukraine can last, right? Then phase 2 was, Ukrainians actually holding up pretty well. They're doing all right, right? They've kept the Russians from getting to Kiev. They've kept the Russians from really toppling the government, taking over the country. That was phase 2. Phase 3, which began maybe about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, was, wow, not only are the Ukrainians holding the line, they're actually retaking thousands of square miles of territory that Russia took early in the war, including parts of Ukraine that Russia has already declared to be parts of Russia, right? So we're getting to phase 4, which is like, how does that play out where the two sides have shown, I mean, the Ukrainians have really shown us that these two sides are much more evenly matched than anyone expected months ago, least of all President Putin himself. So as we go into the winter, what Putin is trying to do is he's trying to weaponize the weather, basically, right? He's trying to, and this is an old Russian tactic. I mean, your listeners who know their history of the Napoleonic Wars will know that Russia has been using General Winter, General Moroz, as it is in Russian, since the cold forced Napoleon's army to turn around from Moscow and march back to Paris half dead, right? He's doing it again. And what they're doing is they're targeting energy infrastructure that provides heat and power to major Ukrainian cities, including in particular the capital, Kiev, right as nighttime temperatures in Ukraine start to dip into the teens or below in Fahrenheit, below freezing. And the idea is to freeze over Russia, the Ukrainian popular support for the war, to freeze over the war effort itself, on the one hand, and to kind of create pressure within Ukrainian society for Ukrainians to say, okay, maybe we should, sue for peace now. The problem is that's not what's happening in Ukrainian society right now. I mean, you talk to people in Kiev, you talk to people in Kharkiv, you talk to people around the country, and the worse Russia tries to punish Ukrainians by knocking out their power and heat and water with it, in a high-rise building, which is most of the cities in Ukraine. When you knock out the power, nobody has power or heat or internet service or water either, right? You talk to most people, and the sense is, we've been through this before as a society, right? Ukrainians still have memory of World War II, right? The two battles of Kiev were two of the most horrific battles on the Eastern Front. They weren't Stalingrad, but they were close. So there's like a kind of cultural memory of suffering during wartime that people can latch onto. And two, it's just after 10 months of this totally illegitimate war against Ukrainians, it just makes their resolve stronger, right? They say, look, this is what we are fighting against. We are fighting against an enemy that is targeting civilian infrastructure and power plants in the dead of winter. This is why we fight, right? As Ukrainians is what you'll hear. Putin's justification makes sense on the logic of Putin's rationale for launching the war, which was Ukraine is a US-backed Nazi state that is trying to commit genocide against ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, and we must defend them. And also we must teach, the decadent West with their 72 genders a lesson. But as a matter of practical execution, they're knocking out power. They're making huge numbers of a quarter of Ukraine doesn't have reliable access to power right now. That's 10 million people. As a practical matter, they're committing a human rights violation. But it's not even working for what the Russians wanted to work for, which is to freeze over Ukraine's resolve in this war. So that's how I would explain both Putin's clip and what the other side of it actually is right now. The interesting question is, okay, you have a war where both sides have shown themselves to be reasonably evenly matched. Where does it end, right? And is there a world in which you can actually convince both sides to sit down and talk about a reasonable settlement? Everyone understands that at some point there's going to have to be some compromise. Neither side's willing to do it yet, right? I mean, Putin said flatly over the weekend he's not willing to talk to the Ukrainians unless they accept all of his territorial demands, which is basically to say we will only talk to the Ukrainians if they surrender, which is obviously not acceptable to the Ukrainians. The interesting dynamic on the Ukrainian side is, having shown that they can retake some territory from Russia, there are a lot of people who say, well, we should just keep going. We should take back Crimea, which was try to take back Crimea, which was illegally occupied in 2014. We should try to continue to push further east. And it will be hard, I think, for Zelensky to resist pressure from the most kind of hardcore nationalist types within Ukraine to even begin to explore some kind of compromise with Putin. So I think it's actually quite a dangerous phase of the war, even if I think the cold is going to and the winter is going to make a lot of the fighting stop for a couple of months here.
See, this is why we have people on the program who know what they're talking about, the tagline of this show, because I don't know anything of, well, I mean, obviously, other than reports, you wrote a fantastic article over on GZEROmedia.com about this that we posted on our show account IG page. And this is great. Like, this is the kind of stuff that people here in the US don't understand what's happening over there. And I want to expand on that a little bit because earlier today I saw Lana Zerkow. I think she's an assistant to the energy minister in Ukraine. She was on Fox News with our friend Mike Emanuel. And I saw a stat there on the bottom scroll that said the U.S. has sent Ukraine $19 billion so far in security aid in 2022. We had our live show in D.C. last month. Idris Ali, friend of the program, foreign policy correspondent over at Reuters that's been covering this. And he said if the U.S. aid is stopped, he doesn't see this Ukraine putting up the defense that they're putting up, the retaking of some of the territories like you've mentioned, within a couple of months, they could easily go under. I want to ask you, first, do you agree with a little bit of that assessment? But secondly, now that the House is been overtaken by Republicans, and we've already heard Kevin McCarthy and some others, they've kind of been tempered down by Mitch McConnell about the Ukraine aid. But if we see a stop in Ukraine aid, at least from the U.S. government, how much longer do you think this will last? Will there be a bargaining chip here? Will Putin play his hand, or will Zelensky, say, hey, now let's come to the table, knowing that the aid will be slashed in half or even all of it?
That's absolutely, I mean, listen, there's no question that without U.S. aid and weapons, the Ukrainians would not have been able to get, well, at least to phase 3 of the war, which is taking back territory. I think the Ukrainians did pretty well early on, just holding off the Russians, even without a huge amount of U.S. aid. Although it should be noted that since 2014, the U.S. has been giving the Ukrainians a lot of weapons and training. So, even before the war started. Without any of that, Ukraine is probably having an even harder time holding off Russia. But the basic premise of your question, I think, is correct. Without U.S. aid, Ukraine certainly can't continue to retake territory, and I think things would get pretty hairy for the Ukrainians pretty quickly. Yes, McCarthy has made the statements about no more blank check for Ukraine. I don't think there's a world where the U.S. cuts aid entirely to Ukraine. That's hard for me to imagine. But what's going to be interesting is that the weapons, the weapons support that we're sending to Ukraine is actually, an important kind of dial for the U.S. to kind of dial up or dial down or send signals to the Ukrainians about what the U.S. wants, the Ukrainians to do without having to come out and say, hey, you know what? It'd be great if you sat down with Vladimir Putin and made peace. Like, no U.S. president's going to say that, right? Like, the optics of breaking with Ukraine that strongly would be pretty damaging. But by drawing down the military support, quietly, that's a way of sending a message that, hey, maybe it is time to explore some kind of compromise. My guess is that will be driven by the White House, though, rather than by the Republican caucus in the House. But it's certainly something to watch, because I think what the Americans want to avoid is having a big political split with the Europeans, particularly the Eastern Europeans, about whether we're supporting Ukraine and how much. Like, the U.S. doesn't want to get into a whole argument about who's supporting Ukraine more, whom it matters more to, right? The U.S. just wants to be on message saying, we support Ukraine's right to defend its territory. We support Ukraine's right to defend its sovereignty. We are united with our NATO allies in that principle. But then if they want to adjust the situation, put pressure on Zelensky quietly, they can draw down the aid as a weapon. And I think we will start to see that debate creep up early in the new year. I mean, nobody wants this war to go on endlessly, and I think that will come up. It may come up because McCarthy and the Republicans in the House push it, and then it becomes more of an issue. But I don't think there's a world where the aid is cut entirely. I mean, I don't think there's a significant number of Republicans who also think it's important to support Ukraine, right? You have a split within the Republican Party, the kind of more Marjorie Taylor Greene side of the party is flatly opposed to any aid at all, but there's an awful lot of more traditional Russia hawk Republicans in the House, and of course certainly in the Senate, as you mentioned, which I think will keep any circumstance from occurring where the U.S. decides that they cut off the Ukrainians entirely. That doesn't seem likely to me.
Yeah, we call them the Freedom Caucus, and they're not that serious, those folks over there. The disingenuous part of the Republican Party, which I think people don't harp on. They just don't lump the entire party in there, which is fair to a certain extent. But it's that loud minority that's in right now that really wants to cut this off. All right, when we come back after the break, under 10 minutes, 2 topics happening overseas, the protests that are happening in Iran, China's COVID policy. Alex and I are going to break it down after the break. All right, now we'll come back on this side.
Was that answer clear enough? I mean,
yeah, that was great.
Okay, all right.
Dude, I remember I'm listening to you while also formulating next question, while also making sure my soundbite here, like I got so
I got you.
I'm listening to it. And I truly listen to the episodes back afterwards, but so far you've been fantastic, no joke. All right, well-oiled machine here. My video producer who's watching this, Tim. None of this, please, makes the thing. All right. Now we get into this. All right, Alex, we talked about a couple topics here. 10 minutes we're going to put on the clock. It's a fake timer, but we're going to get into 2 issues right now. We've done a lot on the first topic here with Iran's protests that happened. If you haven't checked out those episodes with Kamen Mohammadi, the famous Iranian journalist and author, Guy Sunni is a human rights attorney as well, and the director of the Atlantic Strategic Council, both of them broke down what is happening with the protest, and both of them are of Iranian descent. But if you've missed this news on Thursday, the Islamic Republic not finally, I shouldn't say it like that, but they executed one of the first folks that they've captured in this movement in Mohsen Sakari, if I'm saying his name correctly, the 23-year-old, for the crime, by the way, of waging war against God. Okay. Or I don't know how to say it in Farsi. I can already hear my ex-girlfriend yelling at me that I didn't pronounce it properly in his name. So we leave that there. But so obviously the protests are still happening after, what happened with the death of Masa Amini. There's been so many needless arrests and death that have been happening in this country. And then there's been different takes across. I just mentioned Gisu, who we're going to play a sound from in a minute, but other prominent Iranians that are living here in America and abroad that are saying certain things that Western civilization should be doing, these Western governments should be doing. I want to play a little bit of what Gisu said recently on MSNBC with my buddy Eamon Mohideen. She was on his show this past week. I'll get your reaction on the other side.
In terms of the removal of the CSW, that is what Iranian women's activists in the country have requested. They think that the Islamic Republic will respond to pressure. There also needs to be a very strong global condemnation of the executions. There needs to be more tangible action. And in the past, there was a moratorium that the Islamic Republic issued on drug-related offenses that carried the death penalty. And that was due to the European Union cutting funding for anti-drug trafficking programs. And so the engagement didn't help there, but the pressure did.
All right, Alex, what do you make of not only Gisu's comment, but also what can Western I posed this question to her because, again, not well versed in it, not of Iranian descent myself. Obviously feel for what is happening there and this morality police that they have, that people here conflate communism and socialism, all these terms, and all you got to do is watch and pay attention to this issue that's playing out in this country and the lack of rights that women have in that country, that they have a morality police going around making sure that there's good hijab and bad hijab, and who can be arrested based on that, just that principle alone. So what do you make of everything that's happening with the protests in Iran, the recent killing of this person that I just mentioned, and then Gisu's comments as well?
Well, look, I mean, these are the most significant protests you've seen in Iran since 2009. Those protests were touched off by, election irregularities, but then took on a broader kind of significance of anti-corruption, frustration with the regime. These protests really, I mean, it's remarkable what's happened. The longevity of these protests is incredible. The resilience of the protesters is incredible. And what's so interesting about these protests, one of the things that's interesting about them, is that they're essentially leaderless, right? There's no like one person or group of people who are leading these. I mean, it is a kind of zeitgeist of frustration amongst the younger generation of Iranians, right? I mean, these are people who were born way after the Iranian Revolution, right? So the horizon of their memory is not, that the Iranian Revolution was, a great throwing off of the Shah's tyranny, which for a lot of young Iranians, 40 years ago, it may have seemed that way. This is a generation that has known nothing but the repressive style of the Iranian theocracy, and so they question it more. The leaderless aspect is interesting. So far, the government has responded with crackdowns and these high-profile kind of arrests and executions. They haven't brought out the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to really start smashing heads the way that I worry they may soon. The thing about a leaderless protest is it's hard for it to make headway because it's hard to kind of filter demands up to a certain group that is able to press those demands of the government. But also, leaderless protests are really hard to stamp out without using a level of widespread ultraviolence that can very quickly backfire. And that, I think, is the thing to watch in how the Iranian regime responds domestically to what's going on in the coming weeks. I mean, Supreme Leader Khamenei has made he made no bones about it, right? He's not going to listen to what these people are saying, right? He's not, this whole fiasco about how they were going to maybe disband the morality police. I mean, this was a total smokescreen. The New York Times reported that it was going to happen, and everyone said, that's not what's actually going to happen. And then they looked and they said, yeah, it's actually not going to happen, right? So the regime is not giving any quarter on this at all. And I think it's going to reach a very critical phase soon when the regime needs to decide if they are actually going to crack down much harder. And if that generates more backlash and you get this kind of tipping point scenario where enough people say this is absolutely insane, the government is killing people in the streets just because, women don't want to have to wear a headscarf in public all the time, right? We don't know. There's no way to know. Iran is so much of a black box, for those of us outside the country. I mean, I defer to the knowledge of those who you've talked to who who are of Iranian descent, who are super well connected, understand the specifics of what comes next. But the big picture question is, how hard do they crack down now, and what is the backlash? As far as what the West can do, look, it's tricky. I mean, the baseline that you're working with the Iranians is already one of the most isolated governments in the world, right? It's not like with Russia, which was one of the largest economies in the world, well integrated with the rest of the global economy, and the US could slap a bunch of sanctions on Russia and hope it made a really big difference. The comparison is interesting. What happened? Well, we've had a pretty bad effect on the Russian economy and investment in Russia and all these things, but has it deterred Putin from what he sees as an existential issue for Russia, for him personally, for the Kremlin? No. Similar situation in Iran, except that the difference is we've already sanctioned the hell out of the Iranians. So there are certain, Gisu's point about specific measures affecting specific issues, she's absolutely right. I think on the broader question of, can you force the Iranian regime to back down from an issue that they think is, both from a political and potentially from a theological perspective, is essential and existential for their regime? It's a very tough question. Certainly, the exercise of putting more sanctions on Iran would be welcome to send a signal. Whether that signal would have a desired effect on changing Iran's behavior, I'm more skeptical. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea to do as a signal, and as a signal of support for the protesters and of disapproval of what the Iranian government is doing. But again, the practical effects of it, I'm skeptical.
Mm. Well, I mean, I know one thing both of them mentioned to Nick and I when we were recording those episodes respectively was continue the hashtags, the amplification, the show of support. At least what they were hearing from people inside the country was enormous. So continue to amplify those videos, whatever you see on social media. 11 weeks so far that the protests have been happening since Mahsa Amini's death there back on September 18th, I think it was. I want to get into the China struggling with their COVID policy. If you haven't heard about this story, you can go check it out across whatever media outlet you look at. But obviously, China had zero COVID restrictions recently implemented, and it confined millions of people to their homes. It sparked protests and demands for President Xi to resign. Alex, for our audience that's not familiar with this, maybe they've seen the viral video of the man being dragged out of his house. If you haven't seen this video, it's got millions of views online, where the Chinese government came in and everyone was all in their garbs, taking him out of his house forcefully. Can you tell our audience a little bit about where we are with that, with China kind of laxening some of those restrictions on their folks, and why they even implemented it in the first place? There was a spike of cases that went up in Beijing, but take our audience inside everything that happened there in China.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the very start of the pandemic, China has used an extreme form of lockdowns and restrictions in order to stop the spread of the disease, right? This has been right from the start. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, and this was true even after vaccines were developed, there's a couple reasons for that. One is that China has a pretty sizable elderly population. So the people who are, truly most vulnerable to bad outcomes from COVID, large population of elderly. The Chinese vaccine doesn't really work so well. I mean, you can raise questions about even the Western vaccines don't prevent transmission, so on and so forth. But they do keep people from dying. The Chinese vaccines are of much poorer quality, and vaccination rates are very low, particularly among the elderly. So what President Xi Jinping was worried about is he didn't want to have a situation on his hands where tens of millions of elderly Chinese were dying. Right. So there was a practical consideration there. There was also a political consideration. It was a point of pride for the Chinese government early on that they were able to keep their cases so low. Caveat: China's a bit of a black box when it comes to statistics, as well, as any economist will tell you. But the indications are that they managed to avoid widespread outbreaks like the ones that we saw, in northern Italy and in the New York area, and some of the other, kind of big spikes early in the pandemic in the West. And that was a point of pride for the Chinese government. It was another kind of notch in their, hey, dysfunctional democracies, look how well we do it over here with our smoothly functioning autocracy, right? I mean, they've been trying to make that case for a long time, right? That things just run better if you have an autocratic regime where the economy is good and hundreds of millions of people are coming out of poverty. A little authoritarianism is okay. People will put up with it, right? So early on, it was a political thing too. Ha ha ha! Look, we're handling this well. We've had zero, our death rates are so low. Meanwhile, the West is scrambling through lockdowns up, lockdowns down, wave this, wave that, not able to handle it. The problem with that was that, as you say, recently, people started to get really fed up with this. I mean, the economic cost of the lockdowns globally was an issue because it slowed down the Chinese economy, but inside of China as well, it really started to affect people, right? And so the trigger for these recent protests was yes, there was the video of the guy being frog marched out of his house. There was also an apartment building fire in the capital of Xinjiang, which is the western region of China, where a number of people died, and it was believed that they had died because the authorities had basically welded the doors shut to enforce a COVID quarantine. And that set people off. And so you start to see protests in Beijing, across the country, in universities. I mean, 1989 Tiananmen Square, this was not, but it was certainly the biggest and most widespread protest against a nationwide kind of Chinese policy that we've seen since 1989. And so people started to say, wow, this is a real problem for Xi Jinping. The upside of being the most powerful leader in China since Mao, being a sort of basically an autocrat, the upside of that is you can do what you like. Downside of that is when things go wrong, they blame you. And so the Chinese government has actually, kind of been in a tough spot recently on this question. Do they relax the COVID restrictions, knowing that it could possibly lead to precisely the terrible outcome that they were, trying to avoid for these past 2 years, which would have both a negative effect from a human perspective, because a lot of people would die, and on top of that, a political perspective, people say, wait, you locked us in our houses for 2 years only to let us out, and now people are dying like crazy. What the hell is wrong with you? You got it wrong, right? So there's a political aspect. And then there's also, just kind of the precedent, like what do they do next? Do they lock back down? Does that piss people off even more? So what they've done now is they have decided to relax some of those restrictions, but it's going to be interesting to watch, because it really is, both a human and an economic and a political dilemma for, a leader, Xi Jinping, who until now has been, cruising his way into the history books as the most powerful Chinese leader in modern Chinese history. And so, it's interesting. We did a story with some folks from Shanghai earlier this year about what life was like under quarantine. And it was absurd. I mean, one person in an apartment complex would have COVID, and they would lock down the entire complex, right, for like 2-3 weeks. We talked to a woman who told us she would sneak out of her apartment in the mornings into the garden in the courtyard of the complex to steal cherries from the cherry tree to make cherry jam, because there was nothing else. So it really was, the zero COVID policy, which is so called because the aim is to have zero COVID cases and zero deaths, really has backfired for the Chinese regime, and I think in a way that much more quickly than anyone expected. let's see what happens next. On one hand, it'd be good if the Chinese economy opens up, it'd be good for the global economy, right? This is the second largest economy in the world. When they're all locked in their houses and the factories are all shut, that's bad for the global economy. It's bad for demand for the rest of us. But we'll see what happens, because if large numbers of people start dying in China now, they're going to have to lock down again. And then I think it would get politically dicey much more quickly, because people would say, we were locked down, you let us go, now you're locking us down again. It's too much. Yeah.
But listen, my takeaways on both of those things, I think we got under 12 minutes there. So pretty good there on the
we run over
timer.
10.
It's a fictional timer.
It's a big world out there, man.
It is a big world out there. And you know what? My takeaways are, to bring it back home here to the US. And I've made this point to folks, specifically the Latin American folks that are here now in the US, that have carried over communism and socialism as their upbringings into here, and now are conflating those terms to what's happening here in this democratic country. When you want to talk about communism and socialism, which are not the same things, when you want to talk about it, take a look at what is happening in Iran, not a communist state, but an authoritarian state, and you look at what's happening in China. Both of those countries is not what is happening here. We do, again, now we're limiting rights on women's rights, and then we're doing certain things that China's doing as well with COVID lockdowns early on, but not to that extent. Welding a door. Imagine what you just said playing out here. And it drives me nuts that the people that not only conflate the terms, but also look at other countries and say we're heading in those directions, drives me absolutely nuts. We leave it there. My thank yous to Alex Kliment. Alex, you did fantastic today. How do you think you did filling in for the incomparable Nick Severi there?
The incomparable, the timeless, the selfless. I think I was all right.
These are great attributes. We got to see if Nick will keep some of these. But my thank you.
Tell him I said that. No.
Yeah, well, he'll be here listening to this episode. Listen, my thank yous to you for being on the program. Audio podcast platforms, you know them by now: Apple, Spotify, Google. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, please, or just type in, if you're not a subscriber on YouTube, Can We Please Talk Podcast will come right up. Hit the subscribe button. I want to say shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do it without them. We can't do it without each and every one of you that listens to this program. The people that leave the stupidest comments on our YouTube videos that make absolutely no sense. I think you meant those for Newsmax videos, folks. But we can't thank you enough for watching and listening. As always, I am Mike Leon.
And I'm Alex Kliment.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.